The morning sun stretched across the living room of the small white house that had stood on Oakwood Lane for nearly 50 years. Margaret Collins moved slowly but steadily through the kitchen, her hands familiar with every cupboard, every drawer, every shelf. At 75, she found herself relying more on memory than on sight or strength. She could no longer lift heavy pots the way she once did, and her back often ached when she stood for too long. Yet, the simple act of preparing tea was one ritual she refused to give up. On this particular morning, her grandson Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table. He was only 16, with tousled brown hair that refused to be tamed, freckles still scattered across his nose, and eyes that carried a light both mischievous and thoughtful. He was visiting for the weekend, as he often did, since his parents, Margaret's daughter Karen and son-in-law Michael, were busy with work and travel. Margaret loved these weekends more than anything. Ethan wasn't just her grandson. He was her companion, her student in the art of small joys, and sometimes her teacher in the mysteries of youth. Margaret hummed softly as she poured the boiling water into the teapot, letting the steam rise and fog her glasses. She remembered how her late husband, Robert, used to stand by the counter and joke about how she made tea strong enough to wake the dead. She smiled faintly at the memory, feeling both warmth and loss. It had been 12 years since Robert passed away, but grief was a quiet companion that never left entirely. Ethan watched her carefully. "Grandma," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Yes, sweetheart?" Margaret replied, steadying the porcelain teapot in her hands. He hesitated, chewing the inside of his cheek the way he always did when something weighed on his heart. "Can I tell you something? But you have to promise not to get mad." Margaret chuckled, still focused on pouring the tea into 2 mugs. "Oh, you know I could never stay mad at you. What's on your mind?" It was then that Ethan's words came, simple but powerful enough to make her hands tremble and nearly spill the tea. "Grandma," he whispered, "I don't think Mom and Dad understand me the way you do. Sometimes I feel like you're the only person who really listens." Margaret froze. The mug in her hand clinked lightly against the saucer as her fingers shook. She set the teapot down quickly to avoid spilling, her heart beating in her chest like a drum. Of all the things Ethan could have said, she hadn't expected this confession, this deep truth that carried both a compliment and a plea. She turned to face him, her eyes wide with concern. "Ethan, oh, sweetheart," she murmured, walking slowly to the table. "Why do you feel that way?" Ethan shrugged, but his voice carried a tremor. "It's just, Mom and Dad are always busy. They talk at me, not with me. They care, I know they do, but it's like I can never say what I'm really thinking. With you, it's different. You let me be me." Margaret sat down heavily, her knees aching as they always did when she bent. She reached across the table, placing her wrinkled hand gently over his. Her fingers were frail, but her touch carried the strength of decades of love and sacrifice. "Ethan, I listen because I love you," she said firmly. "And I always will. But your parents love you too, more than anything in this world. They might not always show it in the way you need, but their hearts are full of love for you." Ethan's eyes welled with tears, though he tried to blink them away. "Sometimes I wonder if they'd even notice if I wasn't around." Those words stabbed Margaret's heart like a blade. Her breath caught, and for a moment she couldn't speak. She remembered being a young mother herself, overwhelmed and exhausted, and she remembered the guilt of not always being present for her children. She knew how easy it was for love to get buried under responsibility. But she also knew the danger of a young person feeling unseen. "Ethan," she said with a trembling voice, "you are seen. You are loved. Don't you ever doubt that. You mean the world to all of us, especially me." Ethan finally let the tears fall, and Margaret stood, moving around the table to wrap him in her arms. His shoulders shook as he leaned into her embrace, and she stroked his hair gently, just as she had when he was a toddler afraid of thunderstorms. For the rest of the morning, they sat together, sipping tea slowly and talking openly. Ethan shared how hard it was at school, how he felt different from his friends, how the pressure to fit in often suffocated him. He confessed fears about the future, college, growing up, making choices that felt too big for his young shoulders. Margaret listened without interruption, her heart swelling with both sorrow and pride. She didn't pretend to have all the answers, but she knew listening itself was sometimes the most powerful gift. As the hours slipped by, Margaret found herself reflecting on her own youth, her own struggles that she never spoke about. She told Ethan about how she once felt invisible in her own family, about how she longed for someone to truly hear her. She shared stories of her mistakes, her regrets, and her triumphs. Ethan listened intently, surprised to hear his grandmother's life was not just a neat quilt of perfection, but a patchwork of challenges and resilience. By afternoon, Ethan was smiling again, lighter somehow, as though releasing his secrets had lifted a heavy weight. He helped Margaret water her plants, walked with her in the garden, and even convinced her to play a game of cards. Laughter echoed through the small house, mixing with the chirping of the crickets outside. But that night, when Ethan had gone to bed, Margaret sat alone in the living room, her teacup cold in her hand. His words replayed in her mind. "Sometimes I feel like you're the only person who really listens." They haunted her, reminding her how fragile the connection between generations could be. She resolved, with all the strength left in her, to help bridge that gap between Ethan and his parents. She knew it wasn't enough for her to be his safe harbor. He needed his parents' harbor too. The next morning, Margaret picked up the phone and called her daughter. She spoke gently but firmly, explaining what Ethan had shared. At first, Karen was defensive, hurt even. But as Margaret continued, she heard her daughter's tone soften. By the end of the conversation, Karen was crying quietly. She admitted she and Michael had been so focused on providing for Ethan's future that they had neglected his present. That weekend ended with more than just tea and conversation. When Karen and Michael arrived to pick up Ethan, they stayed longer than usual. Margaret gently encouraged them all to sit together. Slowly, with careful words, she opened the door for Ethan to express what he hadn't been able to say. His parents listened, really listened, and though the conversation was not easy, it was healing. Margaret watched from her armchair as her grandson finally found his voice with his parents. She felt tears blur her vision, but they were tears of relief. She knew the road ahead would not be perfect, but something had shifted, something precious had been reclaimed. As the family gathered their things to leave, Ethan hugged his grandmother tightly. "Thank you, Grandma," he whispered. "For everything." She kissed his forehead, her heart full. "Always, my dear. Always."